Number one is disobedience. The children of Israel had heard from God, had heard from His voice about worship, and that there would be no graven images. And yet, in their loneliness, they decided to do what the culture told them to do. Their culture told them this constituted worship. This is what it's supposed to look like. This is how it's supposed to feel. And so they built an idol, a golden calf. And Aaron said, we're going to have a feast, and it's going to be a feast unto the Lord. If you check the text real carefully, the word for Lord there will be a capital L and then an O-R-D that are small case capitals. That's the English translator telling you that the word being translated there is the special word God gave Moses at the burning bush. Aaron's intent was that they were to worship the true and living God, but they were going to do it according to the terms of the culture. And it was a direct disobedience of God. What happens to God's people who are on God's mission, who are going toward God's promise, with God's protection, with God's provision, when they are directly disobedient to God? Well, let me tell you what happens. What happens is when we are disobedient to God, then we grieve His Holy Spirit. And when we grieve His Holy Spirit, then we quench His Holy Spirit in our lives. The Holy Spirit of God is the manifest presence of God to us today. That pillar of smoke, that pillar of fire, symbolically in the Old Testament, that represents the Holy Spirit, guiding, leading, directing. For us in the New Testament age, the presence of God in our lives is His Spirit that is within us. How do I know that I've been saved, that I've been born again? 1 John 4:13 says, we know that we live in Him and He in us because He's given us His Spirit. Romans 8:16 says, His Spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. Here's what happens when God's people are trying to do God's work, but they're disobedient along the way. They grieve His Spirit. And His Spirit thus grieved is quenched. And the Holy Spirit, when He is quenched in a believer's life, will over time result in that believer beginning to doubt his or her own salvation. Begin wondering, where is God? What happened to God? I used to experience Him in my life. In my prayer time, I used to know His presence. When I opened His Word, He used to speak to me. When I came together to worship with God's people, I used to experience His movement. What happened? My guess is what happened is, in disobedience, you quenched the Spirit. God's Spirit is there to bear witness in our lives of His presence. It's possible for God's people to be on God's mission towards God's promise, under God's protection, with God's provision, but without experiencing God's presence. I wonder, do we experience the presence of God in our worship? Listen, the Holy Spirit is intended to be the presence of God in our life. If you're at a place in your life where you're doubting your salvation, you're doubting that whether or not you're walking with Him anymore, go back to that place where you first trusted Him and then ask the Lord to show you that point in your life where you disobeyed Him. You confess your sin. He's faithful and just to forgive you of your sin, to cleanse you of all unrighteousness, and you will rediscover the Spirit of God in